if I had to guess, and the amount of time it takes to get a determinate tomato to produce, you probably would have to have 4 or 5 other plants to have that same amount produced by the time your determinate tomatoes would give you tomatoes in that big flush. So I'm sure a lot of people have already started buying tomato plants and starting seeds and all that, but there's a way to get tomatoes throughout the year, and by planting the right variety or different kinds of varieties. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and that we're really going to focus on indeterminate versus determinate tomatoes. And then also variety can kind of go into that as well. Not started tomatoes yet, but we are getting very close in here. The other day it was 92 degrees in the greenhouse, so it's a little warm. But right in the middle, we're going to go through these rutabagas here, and then we're going to put our first tomato plant there. And probably, I'd say about a week or two maybe. We're going to watch the weather, but that's where it's going to go, which has kind of spurred this whole conversation. So a lot of this stuff, like we've been saying, is we're actively clearing out different sections of the greenhouse, trying to get ready for it. And the tomatoes are definitely going to go right there. There's going to be an actual tomato plant. You're probably thinking, what do I mean by an actual tomato plant versus a fake tomato plant? Well, in this side of the greenhouse going all the way down on that bed, we're going to do all ground cherries. But in that middle one right there, we're actually going to do like a regular tomato plant that you would think about. Ground cherries, in my opinion, they I get that they fall in the family, but they just kind of don't count. So we are looking to plant our first tomato utilizing the greenhouse roughly about probably a month ahead of schedule. So 2 weeks at least ahead of schedule. So I'm excited about it, but that's made me think, what can I put in this greenhouse to ensure that I get as many tomatoes as possible out of my garden, out of this greenhouse, for me to set up so I can get an earlier harvest, and then at the same time be getting heavy harvest for canning, and then a slow, steady harvest to munch on throughout the year. So it's a little warm in the greenhouse, so I don't really want to go in there and start sweating today because it's actually a cool day, which makes me really excited about my spring garden. But if I'm going to plant a tomato, this is a tomato cage, your standard tomato cage, but the determinate tomatoes, they generally, in my experience, especially the ones that I grow, get about this tall, so they can be contained in here really well. And then you look at all these other trellises behind us. Like for instance, let's look at this over here. So we have these cattle panels here, and we can grow a tomato on there, but a determinate tomato, if we grew it, would only get to about right here. So then we'd have like all of this space that's not usable, or we could put it back here on this trellis, which is, if you look at this way, see how tall it is. It's probably about 8 feet tall or so, which is going to be a bear to pick stuff off the top, I can tell you that much. But there's a difference between an indeterminate and a determinate tomato. A determinate tomato is basically like it sounds. It's predetermined how high it's going to get, how tall it's going to get. So when you're looking at your varieties, you can see how tall it's going to be, and it also puts all of its tomatoes on in one flush. So once you start getting them and they really start pushing, for me, this is my indication of like, okay, now let's start our next crops, because we can do 2 crops of tomatoes in my area. I'm in zone 8A in North Carolina. So I can do 2 crops of tomatoes. So that's why I put it actually the fake cage right here in the onion bed, because that's where, once my onions are gone, we're going to put our second crop of tomatoes in this bed this year, and they're all going to be Roma tomatoes. They're determinate because they're going to put them all at once. Now, an indeterminate means it is not determined. That is indeterminate, meaning that it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing. And so it can get super big, super tall, but it's also going to continuously put on fruit the whole time, but not as fast. So there's benefits to both of these. So a benefit is, especially if you like to can or anything like that, then your determinate tomatoes are going to put on all of their tomatoes at once, a big flush of them. And so you can harvest a bunch at once. So, and they don't all happen within the same day, but over a period of, a couple weeks or so, you're going to get most of the, if not all of the tomato production from that plant. So that means that you're going to be able to can a lot of cans at once versus like 1 or 2 here or there. But then the downfall of the determinate tomato is it doesn't just keep producing. Like that plant's kind of done. Now I have stretched it before, and what ends up happening every single time is I leave a tomato plant in the ground for the whole season, usually another 2 or 3 months, and get nothing out of it. So it's a little bit painful. And then what happens is disease gets a hold of it, and then it continues to grow, and it's a headache. So with a determinate tomato variety, and we're talking stuff like, for me, the big one is Romas. A lot of your plum tomatoes. When you go to look up tomatoes, you can separate on websites and stuff like that by determinate versus indeterminate. And these will give you your different varieties. But when you're canning, it's a very good thing. Now, I mean, if you don't can, let's say you don't can at all, and you don't care about it, which I kind of recommend that you do, but if you don't, that's okay. Then let's say you like to have parties or something like that. Then you could get a lot of tomatoes to make a lot of food at once versus an indeterminate tomato, which is slower to produce, will grow, but it will produce over the entire season. So you'll be getting tomatoes all the way up until your frost off the same plant. Now the downfall with that is depending on your area. Like in my area, we get diseases really bad. So you got to stay on top of them. Indeterminate tomatoes, you also need to do a little bit more trimming. As a matter of fact, you have to do a lot more trimming. And this is where your single stemming and stuff like that can really come in hand. So for me, or in general, like a determinate tomato, you don't really need to trim those because you want as much growth as you can get to get that big flush, and then you're basically done. So what I'll do, and I'll do a video about this, I'm sure, once I get my tomatoes planted, is I'll trim from the bottom up maybe 6 or 8 inches just so that there's airflow coming underneath. And then I won't trim really much at all from the top portion or from the rest of the plant so I can get a big flush of it. Whereas indeterminate tomatoes, you can kind of control those. You can single stem them, stuff like that, by trimming and whatnot. And it's really good because you can do a number of things with them. So I personally love to propagate. That's my thing. And so this is my propagation station here. I like how that rhymed. And what you'll end up seeing over the course of the spring into early summer is you'll see this fill up with plants that I've propagated, different bushes and stuff like that. But one of them I always do is tomatoes. And so this is my starting point because this gets shade a lot. And then if we come over here, we did kind of go through a number with this, and winter kind of took its toll. But you can see, like here, I've got some rosemary that's propagated. Now they're very small and they're all kind of struggling, to be honest, but once we up pot them, which we're going to do soon, they're going to go and then they're going to be able to grow and we can reuse them. And propagating tomatoes is very, very easy. We use a sucker to do that. I've done videos on that in the past, and I'll link to one at the end of this video about propagating suckers. But if you propagate a indeterminate tomato, then you kind of got to wait a long time to get that tomato, versus a determinate tomato, you'll get that initial flush again. So I start my second crop of tomatoes. Last year I did it like the end of July. This year I'm going to do it around July 4th is my target date to get them in. Basically, as soon as I get my onions out, the tomatoes are going in. I will start propagating them in early June, and we will put a plant in the ground. So I don't have to restart any more seeds. I can just propagate from that actual plant. And then I don't have to start any seeds. I can do that. And then I actually do that myself here so that if somebody wants to buy a tomato plant or something, then they can actually have that. And it doesn't cost me anything but the time to actually propagate it. So I'm saving both ways. So when it comes to propagation, making free plants or whatever, your determinate varieties are better because you're going to get that initial flush. So what happened last year, and last year was the first year that we did this second crop, which worked out great, by the way. But because we did the Roma tomatoes, we actually got the second flush in like late November, early December, and we were able to get like 40 tomatoes off of 2 plants. So it really worked out well. Now we got a lot of green tomatoes, don't get me wrong, they weren't done yet. but it didn't take long. So as you can see, with that in mind, you can make a whole lot based off of a determinate tomato. So one year I grew orange banana tomatoes, and they are an indeterminate variety, and they grew all the way up this trellis to the top. It wasn't this trellis, but it was that high. And then actually would have come back over and down again. So you're talking probably almost 10 feet of growth on that tomato. Now the benefit of that was I got a lot of tomatoes off of it. So there was that. But the other downfall of it was it's really hard to control. Like super, super hard to control. And that was kind of the issue we had was we were tying them up, we were trimming them constantly, we were just working our tomatoes to death, constantly trying to stay on top of them. And it just was a huge headache. So you can see there is a little bit of a downfall to that. Now, if you have plenty of space or whatever, then it's a great way to go, because tomatoes are vines, essentially. They're nothing more than a vine. So you're gonna grow your tomato, and you know, the determinants are more like a bush habit, which I now see. Last year, I actually had a Roma tomato that grew to be about 7 feet tall. So you do get outliers at times. Now there is an honorable mention here, and it's called the semi-determinate tomato. And all that means is you can't classify it as a determinate or an indeterminate tomato. So it can do one of two things. And it's really kind of confusing. So we grew one last year. I got a little teeny weeny harvest off of one. It's kind of my fault. So we're gonna do it again this year because I really want to compare it. So in our garden, we do mostly determinate, and then we do a handful of indeterminate tomatoes. And this year, I'm actually gonna try a dwarf variety of indeterminate tomato, which is, it's called the Geranium Kiss, and it's supposed to get like 3 feet high maybe, but it's supposed to have that quality of an indeterminate tomato where it keeps producing all season long. So I'm gonna have to stay on top of my disease control, which I use a combination of neem oil for that, and I also use peroxide. And as we get closer to the season, I'll do video about the peroxide, because there is kind of like a step-up method to do it. You can't just go out there and be like, hey, it's got a cut, I'm gonna spray peroxide all over it. It doesn't quite work that way. So we'll do that as the time gets closer. But so if you're not subscribed, then definitely subscribe for that, because it definitely helps. But it's a prevention, not really a treatment. It can treat, but it's better as a prevention method. This is my container garden out here, and these two pots on the ends, they're actually gonna be the ones that grow the dwarf indeterminate tomato. So I wanna put them out here there's a number of reasons. One, I wanna isolate them. Two, it gets an afternoon shade. So in the hottest part of the day, this actually gets shaded. It gets early morning to midday sun, and then it'll start to cool down. But three, because it goes into a pot, it's gonna be easier to control. And if I can't trellis it, which I don't plan on doing because it's supposed to be dwarfed, the deal is not to trellis it, then it should be okay in here. So that's what we plan to do on these two here. And then just for the record, in the middle, we plan on putting peppers in the middle. This also allows you to get creative in how you plant your tomatoes. In different places, use different methods. So trellising versus non-trellising versus cages versus pots, all these different things. You know, growing a tomato in a container is a beautiful thing. I mean, there's nothing better. So it definitely lends itself to that, but we want to stay on top of it, and making the educated decision to grow the type of tomato in the right method will really help. It doesn't do you any good to put a determinate bush variety, I'm adding bush variety just to kind of for a descriptor, on a trellis when you don't really need to, and then you're going to tie up your trellis for something that's not even going to produce all season. So there's that. And then also, when that tomato is done, so this bed, the second bed back here, is the one that's going to have the tomatoes in it this year, the determinate tomatoes. So when they're done, before they start producing, I'll have my second crop started over in the other bed. Then I can pull this up, and then I have the option of one, putting another tomato in, or two, putting another crop in completely. So this is allowing me to work my garden more and more. And that's something that I really like, because it gives me the option to work that garden and utilize the space much more effectively than if I just had indeterminate tomatoes around here. Because if I had to guess, and the amount of time it takes to get a determinate tomato to produce, you probably would have to have 4 or 5 other plants to have that same amount produced by the time your determinate tomatoes would give you tomatoes in that big flush. This year, what I'm thinking about doing different is the greenhouse. I have Roma tomatoes started, they're determinate variety. We may put Romas in there, but I actually am thinking about looking for a different tomato to put in. I just need one plant. And so I may just go buy some random determinate tomato to put in to that greenhouse so I can get a different tomato out of it, maybe get a slicer earlier or something like that. So like last year we did our aromas here. This year we're gonna do them here, so we're rotating them and stuff like that. But when the sun gets lower in the sky in the fall, then like if I put the tomatoes in this bed, whatever's behind it will get less sun. So when it's done, I can pull that tomato and then give it more sun. So there's all these things that kind of add up into your determinate versus indeterminate variety choosing. Conveniently, I did not say anything about semi-determinate there because we're not really going to talk about that too much because it's just basically an unclassifiable tomato variety. So we're just going to kind of leave that one out there and let's figure out together how that's going to work. And I am curious how I can get it to work this year. In your garden, you know, I put a poll up recently that asked what kind of tomatoes you grow, indeterminate versus determinate versus both, or like, what is this that I'm saying? So this is what I'm saying. I'm like filling in the gaps, but I'm curious. So let us know in the comments what you do and even why you do it. A lot of people just like to grow indeterminate tomatoes because a lot of the heirloom varieties are indeterminate and you get a lot of crazy looking tomatoes and stuff like that. Not like your just standard red tomato. So there is different reasons for that as well. But if there's a reason why you do it differently than what I said, then by all means, let us know below, because the garden is a personal choice in how you grow. But once you take that step into canning, and then you start trying to figure out how to get things harvestable at certain times, this is where you can really use the varieties to step up your game and really get things out the way you want them. And you can kind of control a little bit of the flow of how the garden will produce for you.